Good morning. Just want to say thank you to Mike for taking care of the music. If y'all are not familiar, I usually lead the worship and song, and so him doing that is a really big favor to me. It allows me to just focus on the sermon and everything. I know that I say it every time, and I will continue to say it every time, so thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. So, without further ado, let's get into it. "24 years ago was one of the most horrific events in human history. It was the Rwandan genocide. During a time of extreme political instability, the Hutu majority indiscriminately murdered the Tutsi minority. This left nearly 1 million dead. Within this tragic setting, Godfried Muhammad, a Hutu, attempted the murder of Ivasta Mkeyawandi and her children. He attacked their home in the night and burnt it to the ground. While her and her children survived, it was probably a traumatic event. He was arrested and sent for jail for these crimes once everything was sorted out. Many years later, after he got out of prison, Gottfried approached Ivasta to ask for forgiveness. Terrified and trembling, he went before her. He fell on his knees, and he begged her for forgiveness. God moved her heart, and she was able to grant him pardon. Not only did she forgive him, but now they are close friends. And when she was asked about their relationship, she says, "Now, if I cry for help, he comes to rescue me. When I face any issue at all, I call him." But if you put yourself in her shoes, wouldn't you have wanted revenge? Wouldn't you have justifiably wanted to get even? And put yourself in his shoes now. Having committed this atrocity and then coming to know the Lord, knowing that you must apologize to this person, knowing that you owe that to her and her family. But you see, Gottfried put his trust in God for reconciliation. He prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed. And then he relied on God to change Ivasta's heart. And God answered that prayer. And if this is not a story of true, miraculous reconciliation, I really don't know what is. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is reconciliation. And so today we're going to pick up in Genesis with Jacob's story. If you're familiar with this story, Jacob stole Esau's birthright. And for this, Esau swore that he would kill Jacob. And so Jacob fled. And during this fleeing, Jacob has an experience with God, and he says, "If you protect me, if you're able to bring me back to my father's land, if you watch over me and prosper me, you allow this blessing to come to fruition, then you will be my God, and I will be faithful to you." And so he's running and fleeing, and he spends many, many years away. And if you're familiar with the story, you know that God does prosper him. God does bless him. And so now it's time for him to come home. The Lord has instructed Jacob, okay, we're going back to the land. I'm going to keep, not only have I kept my promise to bless you, but I'm going to keep the rest of it. I'm bringing you back to the land. And so Jacob heads back home. And when he is near, he receives word that his brother is coming. Not only is his brother coming, but 400 men are coming with him. And so Jacob is naturally terrified. He has no idea what's going to happen. But we know that God has already moved Esau's heart. And upon their meeting, these brothers will reconcile. And so when we, like Jacob, we rely on our own perception, our own meager means to influence reconciliation, this causes us to live in fear. I might have needed to flip that. Making unnecessary sacrifices, being robbed of joy and peace. And so as we examine our text today, we are going to answer the question, how do we seek reconciliation for seemingly irreparable hurts? We will see that reconciliation is a work of God, ensured by faith. Therefore, we acknowledge God. And so if you'll turn with me in your Bibles, our text for today is Genesis 33. Again, that's Genesis 33. I know there's pews in the Bible that are the NIV. It's the same as what I'm using. This is Genesis 33. It's a little bit of a long read, so hang in there with me. I promise it's all part of the story. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. And Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. And last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are tender and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard for just one day, all the animals will die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." Esau said, "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why would you do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord." So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. After Jacob came from Paddan-aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver he bought the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. And so the first point for today is that reconciliation is a work of God. And so briefly, reconciliation defined is the restoration of a relationship. Maybe more simply put, it is putting things right within a relationship. And so as we look back to the text, we see that God has changed Esau's heart. And verse 4 tells us that he ran to his brother and embraced him. It says they kissed him, they embraced and they wept. What a clear change this is from Esau's previous attitude of swearing to kill his brother. However, leading into this, Jacob was terrified. We turn back to chapter 32:11. Jacob prays this prayer. He says, "Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau. For I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. And so, right off, we see even from the previous chapter that Jacob is terrified of his brothers still. He's not trusting in the Lord. And so in the beginning of chapter 33, we see he lifts his eyes and he sees these 400 men coming. And so he arranges his wives and his children by order of importance, just in case Esau does attack. The things that are most important to him will have a chance to flee and escape. This is in the same way he divides the rest of his property into two, as that's also noted in chapter 32, 7 and 8. He says he divides his property in half. That way, if he is attacked, says what is to my left will get away. It basically means half of his stuff will get away. So if he attacks from one side, then that group of possessions and men will perish, but the other half will escape. Which always made me wonder how Jacob knew he would be in the correct side, that he would live to enjoy his possessions still. Which is really neither here nor there, but rather to say he was showing a lack of faith in God. He's willing to sacrifice some of his possessions in order to preserve the rest. The next thing we see is Jacob is giving this large offering. It's first mentioned again in chapter 32. He talks about sending a large flock. And this is what Esau is referencing in verse 8. What is the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met? And so Jacob kind of does a quick sly talk and says, oh, well, it's a gift because I found favor in your eyes. But really, it's a bribe, right? I'm going to send these 400 animals, the sheep and the goats and the best of the choice, and I'm going to send them to my brother ahead of me. And so hopefully I can buy him off with all these possessions. This is additionally a reflection back to the blessing that he stole from their father. Right, Jacob cannot undo that. He can't give the blessing back to his brother, but he can share in the bounty that the Lord has given him because of that. So again, we see that Jacob is taking matters into his own hands in order to create reconciliation between himself and his brother. And all this is completely unnecessary. And so then the last thing that we see in this reunion is that Jacob is intentionally humbling himself into a place of submission. We see that he bows low to the ground 7 times. He calls himself the servant. He says to Esau, my Lord. This is actually even Adonai, which is often used for the Lord, capital L. And so he's in this position of submission. He's humbling himself before his brother. But the thing is that this submission is probably not genuine, but rather it's motivated by fear and guilt. And so he's clearly, again, trying to persuade his brother to be merciful. He's using his meager means to influence his brother. Interestingly, God has already chosen Jacob. That was actually foretold well before he and his brother's birth. And so there is none of this deception that's necessary. And that even goes back to the act of him stealing his brother's blessing. It wasn't necessary to manipulate the situation because God had already chosen him. Now, what manner had God intended to use? That's not in the text. We don't know because Jacob and his mother decided they were going to act and supersede God. But so in all of this, we see that Jacob is just relying on himself. He's relying on his own abilities. He's relying on his own perception rather than trusting God and believing the promises that have been put before him. And so none of this previous or current attempts to persuade his brother were necessary. So Jacob knew by now he's had all this experience, right? He left many, many years ago. He left home. And so there's a whole process of him finding his wives and then having children and then accumulating wealth. And there's the story about he and his father-in-law and the sheep and the spots. And you guys know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. And these ways that God has continued to bless him over and over again. And so he should know that he is in God's favor. So Yahweh had been protecting him, fighting for him, blessing him, prospering him since he left his home many years before. And so just like Jacob, often we react out of fear. Often we react out of our own perception, relying on what we can see, what we think is right, what makes sense to us. And yet, don't we know that God is fighting for us? Don't we know that reconciliation truly is a work of God? It reminds me of a story I heard from a radio preacher many years ago, and so I apologize, I don't know his name. But I believe this to be a true story. He told it in that manner. And he was telling the story. He started in the third person. He says, I know this story about this husband and wife. And this husband, unfortunately, had an affair. And because of this affair, he couldn't bear the shame and guilt, and he left his wife. It's completely destroyed this marriage. And so this wife, obviously grief-stricken, heartbroken, falls on her knees and prays to the Lord, God, heal my marriage. Reconcile this relationship. And this goes on for years. I don't recall how long. I think 7 years. And after 7 years, more or less out of the blue from the way that I understood the story, finally this man approaches his wife again. Doubtlessly, he's also terrified. And he goes before her and he says, wife, I love you. I am so sorry. And you see that God had changed his heart. God had used all that grief and guilt to drive him back to where he belonged. In the same way, at the same time, God was changing this wife's heart, breeding in forgiveness and love. And so as God changed both of their hearts, they then reconciled, right? They're together now. And so that was this pastor's story. He says it took 7 years for him to figure it out. It took 7 years for God to move their hearts and bring them back together. But God reconciled that marriage. I wish I could tell you who it was so you could Google it, because I promise this is a true story. This is the way that God works, right? God takes these relationships that are broken irreconcilably, and we look at it and we're like, okay, well, that's just really sad, and we don't know why God would allow that. We just have to let it go and move on. But God is telling us that he will reconcile us. Right? And so God moved each of their hearts to reconciliation. And so just like that, and just like the two brothers in the story, Jacob and Esau, we ought to be relying on God to change our hearts, to change the other person's heart, to reconcile this conflict. Some of us have conflict within our families. Some of us have conflicts within our marriages. Some of us have conflicts within our professional relationships. Are you giving those to the Lord? Are you praying, God, change my heart. Show me to love this person. God, change their heart. Show them to love me. To forgive my iniquities as I forgive theirs, as you have forgiven all of us. Allow us to be reconciled. That is how we know that reconciliation is a work of God. So continuing on, we're going to move to point number 2. Reconciliation is a work of God that is ensured by faith. Reconciliation is a work of God ensured by faith. And so faith, simply put, is believing that God will do what he says he will do. It's trusting in his word in the Bible. So what I mean, to be a little more clear, by ensured by faith, is that it's not interfering in God's work. It's not manipulating the situation to our own end. But it's trusting in God to change hearts, to reconcile. It doesn't mean that we aren't responsible for our actions. Probably means an apology. It probably means a difficult conversation. If you are on the side that needs the forgiving, it's difficult to humble ourselves. And it's difficult to trust God to move that other person's heart. If you're on the side that needs to do the forgiving, the reconciling, it's difficult to let go. It's difficult to know the wrong that has been done to you and just take it on the chin. And yet, we are ensured by faith that God will change our hearts and their hearts. And so it's not about manipulating a process, but rather about trusting God, being ensured in our faith. And we see that Jacob now goes on to deceive his brother to travel to Succoth, where he's going to establish a permanent dwelling. And so we have seen that these brothers are reconciled. We already saw that Esau's heart has changed. Some of us, okay, so we're probably thinking, okay, but isn't this what you're not supposed to do? Yeah, you're exactly right. It's Jacob. To make it really clear, Jacob, through his entire narrative, is pretty much always what not to do. And that's really, really true with the Bible. Pretty much all of the stories, especially in the Old Testament. But even then, we look at the disciples and go, oh, yeah, they're knuckleheads too. So makes me feel good to have that to relate to, right? But so as, anyway, I tangent, but as what I'm getting at is that we're using Jacob, and some of this is going to sound like, oh, that's a negative example. You're right, it is. Just so we're all clear and on the same page with that. And so we're going to see Jacob deceive his brother. And he uses this elaborate ruse starting in verse 10. And that's still wrong. Oh boy. Verse 12. And Esau says, "Let us be on our way, and I'll accompany you." 13. But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young," etc. And so we already see Jacob trying to manipulate his brother. I'm not honestly sure to what end, but it seems like he should be able to just approach his brother and say, "Hey, I am so glad we're reconciled and I love you. I'm going to go to this other place. I'm not actually going back to Seir right now," because Esau had also moved, and so he was also not still in the land that his father had given him. And so we see this first manipulation of Jacob. And then Esau goes on. He says, "Let me leave some men with you." This could be an attempt to control or rob Jacob. Right, so he's leaving his armed men with him. So this could be an armed escort to ensure Jacob and his family's safety to Esau's dwelling, or this could be a deliberate ruse on Esau's part to keep these armed men with Jacob and guide them to where they're going, and then once they're there, he'll rob him. We know that that's not the case. We know that God already changed Esau's heart. That's really evident from the text over and over again, but that is surely what Jacob was thinking at this point. And so he goes on to say, "Why would you do that? Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord." And so again, we see Jacob being ruled by fear, right? And he's in this situation, and he's trying to manipulate this situation for his own good. He has given this bribe. He's told his brother, "No, I have all these young cows and they're young sheep. Can't drive them hard or they're all going to die. I'm just going to go at my own pace and I'll meet you in Seir." Well, he has no intention of going to Seir. Presumably his brother knows this. But what's happening is that Esau is trying to be a good big brother. And Jacob is trying to ensure that there's no possible way his big brother can take advantage of him, because he's not trusting in this reconciliation. He believes that it's fake. He's relying on his own perception. He's not trusting in the Lord. And how often do we approach these situations in our relationships with contempt? We approach these relationships as if the other person is not really going to forgive us, but they're going to try and one-up us, or they're going to try and come get our stuff, whether it's our pride, whether it's our dignity, whatever it is that we're clinging on to. And so Jacob is still relying on himself rather than on God, in the same way that we still rely on ourselves rather than God. And so in my story from earlier, I was talking about this pastor and his wife. What if this wife had taken matters into her own hands? It might have worked out, or it might have driven this other man further away because he just couldn't handle the shame or the guilt or the pressure. Or I really think he probably thought that he didn't want to be with his wife anymore. I think that he had probably manipulated himself into believing that. And I think if that wife would have tried to pursue him, tried to cling on, it would have just driven a deeper wedge in between them. But rather, she had the wisdom to just turn to the Lord. I think in the same way, on the other hand, if that husband had immediately repented and gone straight back to his wife, hopefully that reconciliation could have happened right then that way. Or what I think is more likely, just because of human nature, not to have a negative view, but is that it would have just spurned even more. And that poor wife, already humiliated, very well may not have been able to accept that apology. Very well may not have been able to do anything with that. And I'm not saying that either of them necessarily responded in the right way or necessarily responded in the wrong way, but rather the point is that they responded with enough wisdom to allow God to do what he does. They went to him in prayer and relied on him. And so regardless of what we do, it's never going to have the same result as allowing God to work, as allowing ourselves to rely on the guidance of the Holy Spirit and allowing God to move hearts and allow God to work in this situation for reconciliation. And so then this brings us to our third point. Reconciliation is a work of God, ensured by faith. Therefore, acknowledge God. Reconciliation is a work of God, ensured by faith. Therefore, acknowledge God. So in the final verses of this Jacob narrative, we see the fulfillment of a vow was made in chapter 28, verse 20. I'm going to read it really quickly. It's pretty short. This is Jacob speaking to the Lord. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." Sorry, my eyes just stopped working for a second there. So in these final verses, we see this promise. And so we know that God has kept his side of this. God has brought him back into his father's land safely. And so here, for Jacob's part, we now finally see that he is acknowledging God's faithfulness. So he goes and he buys land and he sets up an altar. And so we see that he bought land from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This is the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. And so he sets his altar there. And so the space that he is now in is where he came from. And so if we move back just a little bit, we see that he has set up a permanent dwelling in Succoth. It gets named Succoth because that's the type of shelter, little 3 walls with a roof over it that you put your cattle in. But you wouldn't build those if you were still moving all over the place, right? And so he's been basically a nomad for, 40 years or so. And so now he has set up a permanent dwelling in Succoth. And so then he goes from there back to near the city of Aram. And while he's there, he sets up this altar. And so this is this completion of the cycle. In 28:20, he makes this vow, if the Lord will bring me back safely, etc., then he'll be my God. And so here we've seen that he has come full circle, and he buys this plot of land, and he puts an altar on it. This is an establishment of a permanent dwelling, a permanent place, a permanent reconciliation, a permanent reminder of God's faithfulness. And so Jacob bought the land and set up an altar, and he names it El Elohi Israel, which means the God of Israel is a mighty one. And so I think there's a really powerful play on words going on here, right? Because we know that Jacob was renamed Israel. And so Israel, the nation, their God is mighty. But also Israel, the person, Jacob, his God is mighty. And I think that this is just a beautiful play that Moses is doing here. He wrote this. And so this God of theirs is a mighty one. Jacob is acknowledging that God is his strong deliverer. And so he sets up an altar as this form of worship, but it's also a form of permanence, a form of permanent reminder. It's there. He owns the land, and there's this chunk of rock. It's not going anywhere. It's that permanent reminder. It's that reminder that God was faithful to Jacob. He reconciled him to his brother and brought him back to his home. And this also foreshadows what God will do for all mankind through his son Jesus. He will reconcile all mankind to himself, bringing us to our eternal home in heaven with him. And so we acknowledge God through worship. Our worship may include singing, dancing, poetry, spoken word, prayer, all manner of music. The list is long. It may also include, probably it should include, it ought to include some form of permanent reminder. It's the way that we recall what God has done for us. If this means stacking some rocks in your backyard, that's cool. Maybe make it a little grill, put a little inscription on it. I had a really good example in my preaching class. One of my peers was telling us about his dad's journal. His dad is also a pastor. And so his dad's journal is 20 years worth of God showing up and getting him through the hard things that he's been doing in ministry. And his dad gave that to him now. And so he has that, the story, the legacy of his dad's ministry, and every time God coming through for his father. And that's a continuation that he now does. But really, it doesn't matter what it is. What really matters is the permanence. Really, it is about the reminder that God is faithful to us. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a very good memory. And it's really easy for me to see God move and see God do something really powerful in my life. And then a month later, I'm in the next storm, and I totally forgot. Well, God already took care of that other thing a month ago. Why would I not expect him to do the same thing that he's told me he's going to do again? And so that's why we make these permanent reminders. We do these things that aren't just, wishy-washy, but they're permanent. They're continuous. If it's a journal, if it's setting up some rocks in the backyard, if it's a painting, I know some people are really into visual art. That's awesome. Make a painting. Some people are musicians. Write a song specifically. Put it in the words. So today we have talked about the work of reconciliation. We've examined Jacob and his brother Esau's long-awaited reunion and understood that reconciliation is a work of God. We saw that though Jacob did not always, we ought to ensure by faith. We saw Jacob acknowledge God by worshiping through building an altar, that act of permanent remembrance, and declaring that the God of Israel is mighty. Leaving us with that understanding, reconciliation is a work of God, ensured by faith. Therefore, acknowledge God. And finally, I want to turn back to that opening image. As we talked about Godfrey and Avesta. And I can't imagine how terrified that man must have been. My knees would have been knocking. And yet, he was convicted by God to go and meet with this woman. And through that act of obedient faith, God had already changed her heart, and he reconciled them. And now they're closer than brother and sister. As she said, anytime I have any need, I call on him, and he comes. What a beautiful picture of reconciliation, and how that glorifies God. And so in the same way, let's praise God for his work of reconciliation. Thank you.